Valeria barely heard the sharp gasp of her assistant before she felt the cold metal slip from her fingers. A sickening plop rang through the air as her diamond ring, the one worth more than most people's yearly salary, vanished into the fountain's shimmering water. "Oh no," her assistant Lillian breathed beside her. Valeria's stomach tightened as she stared at the rippling surface. That ring had been custom-made, an extravagant gift to herself after landing the biggest deal of her career. Losing it wasn't an option. She took a step forward, prepared to roll up her sleeves and fish it out herself when a flash of movement caught her eye. Without hesitation, a man dove into the fountain. Water splashed over the marble edges, soaking his clothes as he searched frantically beneath the surface. Valeria blinked in shock, taking in the drenched figure, dark, wet curls clinging to his forehead, a sharp jawline, and an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Did he just?" Lillian gawked. The man resurfaced, gasping slightly before his hand lifted from the water, fingers curled around the ring. "Got it," he said, his voice rough but steady. Valeria hadn't realized she was holding her breath until she exhaled in relief. She stepped forward, holding out her hand. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped but polite. The man studied her for a moment before placing the ring in her palm. His fingers brushed against hers, sending a strange jolt through her. Up close, she noticed his strong features, striking blue eyes, a slightly crooked nose as if it had been broken before, and an air of quiet strength. "You didn't have to do that," she added, glancing at his soaked clothes. His white button-down clung to his toned chest, and his dark jeans were completely drenched. He shrugged. "Seemed important to you." Valeria hesitated. Normally, men tried to impress her with their wealth or status, but this one, he had just jumped into a fountain for a stranger. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ian," he replied, raking a hand through his wet hair. "Ian Calloway. Valeria Monroe." She studied him curiously. "Can I offer you something as thanks?" "A dry shirt at least," Ian chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll be fine, just happy to help." And just like that, he turned to leave. Something about his easy dismissal unsettled her. She wasn't used to being brushed off. Lillian nudged her. "That was unexpected." Valeria frowned, watching Ian disappear into the crowd. There was something about him, something real. And for the first time in a long while, she found herself intrigued. Valeria couldn't shake Ian Calloway from her thoughts. Days passed, and yet the memory of him dripping wet, eyes steady, brushing his fingers against hers as he handed back the ring lingered like a melody she couldn't forget. It wasn't just his unexpected chivalry that unsettled her. It was the way he had walked away without expecting a reward, something no man in her world ever did. She was accustomed to power and control, to men who saw her as either a conquest or a threat. Ian was different. He had looked at her with neither awe nor calculation, but with something far more disarming, genuine indifference. So when her driver pulled up in front of the high rise where her company's latest project was under construction, and she spotted him across the site, she felt an unfamiliar jolt of anticipation. He was wearing a dark gray t-shirt, sleeves rolled up slightly, revealing strong forearms dusted with dirt. He was speaking to a group of workers, gesturing toward the steel framework towering above them. Lillian, standing beside her, followed her gaze. "You're staring," she noted. Valeria ignored the comment. "Who is he?" Lillian checked the clipboard she always carried. "Ian Calloway, construction foreman, well-respected, efficient. Apparently a single father." Valeria's head turned at that last detail, something tightening in her chest. A father. It wasn't what she had expected. She watched as Ian crouched beside a younger worker, pointing at a blueprint spread across the ground. His expression was serious, but there was an ease to the way he spoke, as if he belonged there in a way she never quite did in her own world. She wasn't sure why it mattered, but it did. Determined, she strode across the gravel, her heels clicking against the uneven surface. When she reached him, he glanced up, surprised but not flustered. "Miss Monroe," he greeted, pushing to his feet. You work here, she stated, more to herself than to him, his lips curved slightly. That tends to be the case with foremen. She wasn't used to being teased. Most men either groveled or tried to undermine her. Ian did neither. I wanted to thank you properly, she said, ignoring the curious glances from his crew. For the other day. I told you no thanks necessary. Valeria tilted her head. Then humor me. Let me buy you lunch. The reaction was subtle but telling the slight hesitation, the way his fingers flexed before he crossed his arms over his chest. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? Because we don't exist in the same world. Something about the bluntness of his words unsettled her. She was used to men wanting her attention, chasing after it. Ian was the first man she had ever met who seemed determined to avoid it. I don't see why that matters, she countered. He studied her for a moment, then exhaled. Look, I appreciate the offer, but I have responsibilities. I can't just drop everything for a lunch invitation. The reminder that he had a child shifted something inside her. Responsibilities. It was a word she knew well, but never in that context. Before she could respond, a voice called out from behind them. Dad, she turned. A little girl, no older than 8, came running toward Ian, her dark curls bouncing with each step. She wore jeans and a faded pink t-shirt, and when she reached him, she grinned up at him, completely at ease. Ian's face softened instantly. Hey, kiddo, thought you were hanging out with Mrs. Ramirez. She had to go to the store, the girl explained before her gaze shifted to Valeria. Who's she? Valeria wasn't sure why she suddenly felt out of place. Ian rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder. This is Miss Monroe. She owns this building. The girl's eyes widened. Whoa. Valeria crouched slightly so they were at eye level. And what's your name? Emma. Nice to meet you, Emma. Emma studied her with open curiosity. You're really fancy. Valeria laughed, taken aback by the honesty. I suppose I am. Ian's expression was unreadable as he watched the exchange. Emma turned to him. Can we get ice cream? Ian hesitated, then looked at Valeria. You still want to buy me lunch? Her pulse jumped. Yes, make it ice cream, he said. And you've got yourself a deal. As they walked toward a nearby cafe, Valeria realized something strange, something unexpected. She was smiling, and she hadn't done that in a long time. The ice cream shop was a small, family-owned place tucked into the corner of a quiet street. It was a far cry from the sleek, high-end restaurants Valeria usually frequented, but there was a warmth to it that surprised her. The scent of fresh waffle cones filled the air, and the soft hum of conversation surrounded them. Emma rushed ahead, pressing her hands against the glass display, her eyes scanning the rows of colorful flavors. Ian stood beside her, his posture relaxed but watchful, as if always aware of his daughter's every move. Valeria ordered last, choosing a simple vanilla, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted it. She was too focused on the way Ian interacted with Emma, the way his gruff exterior softened when she tugged on his sleeve, excitedly listing off her flavor choices. They settled at a small table near the window, Emma happily swinging her feet as she took a bite of her ice cream. Ian leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he regarded Valeria. She wasn't used to being studied so openly. Most men tried to impress her or win her over. Ian simply observed. Why did you insist on this? He asked finally, his tone even but curious. Valeria dipped her spoon into her ice cream, considering her answer. I wanted to thank you. Properly. You're not used to people doing things for you without expecting something in return, are you? The directness of the question caught her off guard. She met his gaze, finding no judgment there, just quiet understanding. No, she admitted. I'm not. Emma, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, licked a drop of ice cream from her fingers. Dad, can we go to the park after this? Ian glanced at his daughter, then back at Valeria. You busy? She hesitated. She had emails waiting, meetings scheduled, an entire empire demanding her attention. But as she looked at Emma's hopeful face and Ian's unreadable expression, she heard herself say, no. I'm not. The park was bustling with families, children laughing as they raced across the playground. Emma ran ahead, climbing onto a swing, her giggles carried by the breeze. Ian sat on the bench beside Valeria, his posture loose but alert, always aware of his daughter's movements. She glanced at him, taking in the way the sunlight highlighted the sharp angles of his face. "You're a good father." His jaw tightened slightly, as if the compliment unsettled him. "I try. She's happy, that says a lot." Ian exhaled, watching Emma pump her legs, gaining height on the swing. "It's not always easy, but she comes first." Always. There was something about the way he said it steady, unwavering, that made her chest tighten. She admired his certainty, his devotion. It was rare to see someone so grounded, so sure of their priorities. She looked away, watching Emma instead. "I never had that." Growing up, Ian didn't press her for details, didn't ask questions she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. Instead, he simply said, "I figured." It wasn't pity in his voice, it was understanding. And somehow that was worse. For a long moment they sat in silence, the distant sound of children playing filling the gaps between them. Then Emma called out, her voice bright with excitement. "Dad, push me higher." Ian stood, walking toward his daughter, and Valeria watched as he placed his hands on the small of Emma's back, gently pushing her forward. She should have left then. She should have thanked him for the afternoon and walked away, but she didn't. Instead, she stayed. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Valeria Monroe let herself feel something real. The evening air carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine as Valeria stepped onto Ian's porch, fingers tightening slightly around the bottle of wine she had brought. It had been weeks since the day at the park, and yet, what was meant to be a single gesture of gratitude had turned into something neither of them had anticipated. Dinners that stretched into midnight conversations. Simple moments, Emma falling asleep on Ian's lap, while Valeria sat across from them, watching the rise and fall of his chest, wondering when she had last felt anything close to this kind of peace. She had never lingered in someone's world before, never let herself get pulled into the quiet, everyday moments that didn't revolve around power or wealth. But Ian had a way of making her forget the carefully constructed walls she had spent years building. As she raised her hand to knock, the door swung open before she made contact. Ian stood there, one hand braced against the frame, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "You're early," he murmured, but there was no reproach in his voice. Just that steady, unwavering presence that had become both a comfort and a complication. She lifted the wine slightly. "Thought I'd surprise you." A slow exhale left him, something flickering in his expression, something she couldn't quite name. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, letting her in. The warmth of his home wrapped around her as she entered. The scent of something rich and savory lingered in the air, and soft music hummed from an old speaker in the corner. Emma was nowhere in sight, which meant she was likely asleep in her room. Ian took the bottle from her, setting it on the counter before turning back. "You always bring something," he noted. "It's what I'm used to," she admitted, slipping off her coat. "I don't show up empty-handed." His gaze held hers for a long moment, something unspoken settling between them. Then he reached for 2 glasses, pouring the wine with an ease that told her he wasn't in a rush. She took the offered glass, letting her fingers brush against his. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. Instead, they stood in his kitchen, the silence stretching between them like something alive. Then, finally, Ian set his glass down, leaning against the counter. "You're not just passing through, are you?" Something in her chest tightened. She knew what he was asking. She had spent her life moving from one deal to the next, one city to another, one relationship, if they could even be called that, to the next, without ever looking back. She wasn't the kind of woman who stayed, except she hadn't been able to leave him. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Ian's expression didn't change. He didn't push, didn't demand more than she was ready to give, but he didn't let her run either. "You don't have to know," he said. "You just have to want to." She had spent her life making decisions based on logic and control. But this wasn't logical. This was terrifying and unpredictable, and she wanted it. So she stepped forward, closing the space between them. Her fingers brushed against his wrist, and he exhaled sharply. Then, slowly, he reached for her. His hands settled at her waist, his touch solid, grounding. And when he finally closed the distance, when his lips met hers, it wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was steady, sure. Like he had been waiting for her to catch up. And for the first time in her life, Valeria Monroe let herself fall. The warmth of Ian's touch lingered against Valeria's skin long after their kiss had ended. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, nor was it uncertain. It was simply filled with something unspoken, something that neither of them had dared to name yet. Valeria traced the rim of her wine glass with her fingertip, her mind spinning in ways she wasn't used to. She had spent years calculating every move, ensuring that nothing ever caught her off guard. And yet, Ian Calloway had managed to undo her without even trying. She glanced at him, taking in the way the soft kitchen light highlighted the sharp lines of his face. Ian wasn't a man who played games. He didn't chase power or wealth, didn't try to impress people with grand gestures. He simply was. And that, more than anything, unnerved her. Because it meant he was real, and real was dangerous. Ian studied her, his gaze steady in a way that made her feel as if he could see straight through the carefully composed exterior she had spent years perfecting. He didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't demand answers she wasn't ready to give. Instead, he poured himself another glass of wine, his movements unhurried. Emma's soft footsteps padded against the floor before she appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Her curls were slightly messy, her oversized t-shirt hanging off one shoulder as she yawned. Valeria had never been around children much, but something about Emma's sleepy vulnerability made her chest tighten. Ian crouched down, brushing a hand over his daughter's hair. "Couldn't sleep," Emma shook her head, then glanced at Valeria with a small, tired smile. "You're still here." Something about the quiet observation made Valeria hesitate. She wasn't sure why, but the fact that Emma had noticed had expected her to leave unsettled her. Ian lifted Emma effortlessly into his arms, shifting her weight against his chest. It was such an easy, instinctive movement, one that spoke of years of familiarity. He wasn't just a father, he was her entire world. Valeria had spent her life surrounded by people who operated in transactions. Love, affection, loyalty, everything had a price. But here, in Ian's home, none of it felt calculated. And she had no idea how to handle that. Ian turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Stay for a little while longer." It wasn't a question filled with expectation or pressure. It was an invitation, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, Valeria found herself nodding. Ian tucked Emma back into bed, his movements careful as he pulled the blanket over her small frame. Valeria lingered by the doorway, watching as Emma's breathing evened out, her tiny hand curled against the pillow. Ian straightened, his gaze meeting hers. "She likes you." Valeria exhaled, unsure of what to do with the unexpected warmth that spread through her at his words. "She doesn't even know me. She knows enough." The weight of his words settled between them. Valeria had never been the person people let their children get close to. She was the one who made ruthless business decisions, the one who kept her emotions locked behind steel walls. And yet, here she was standing in Ian Calloway's home, watching his daughter sleep, her carefully constructed life unraveling with every passing second. When they returned to the kitchen, Ian leaned against the counter, studying her. "You're thinking too much," she huffed out a quiet laugh. "I always think too much," he nodded as if he had already known that. "Then stop." She lifted a brow, "Just like that." His lips twitched slightly. "Just like that." Valeria shook her head, but there was no real frustration behind it, just something close to amusement, something that felt dangerously like fondness. Ian stepped closer, the space between them narrowing. "You don't have to figure this out tonight," she swallowed. But I do have to figure it out. His gaze was steady. Only if you want to. That was the problem, wasn't it? She did want to. She wanted to understand what he was. And for the first time in her life, Valeria Monroe didn't have an answer. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't need one. Not yet. The city lights shimmered in the distance as Ian pulled his truck into Valeria's private driveway. The sleek modern estate stood in stark contrast to the warmth of his home, a fortress of glass and steel, perched high above the world like she had built it to keep everyone out. Valeria sat in the passenger seat, fingers resting lightly on her lap, her expression unreadable. The evening had shifted something between them, something she wasn't sure how to navigate. Ian turned off the engine but made no move to leave. "You're thinking again," she exhaled, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. "I don't know how to shut it off." He studied her for a moment, then reached over, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was brief, but it sent a ripple of warmth through her, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said. "You just have to decide if you want to." She turned her head, meeting his gaze. The weight of his words pressed against her chest, heavy and terrifying. She had spent her life making decisions based on logic, but Ian Calloway wasn't logical. He was steady, real, and completely unlike anything she had ever allowed herself to want. The thought of letting him in, of letting Emma in, was both exhilarating and terrifying, because if she let herself have this, there was no turning back. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. "And if I decide I do," Ian didn't hesitate, "then you stay." It was the simplest answer in the world, but it carried the weight of everything she had been avoiding for weeks. Stay. Not just for tonight, not just for the fleeting moments when she allowed herself to forget who she was supposed to be, but for real. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I don't know how to do this." Ian reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Then we figure it out together." The words settled deep in her chest, an anchor in the storm. For the first time in her life, she wasn't making a decision based on power or strategy. She was making it based on something far more terrifying. She was making it based on love. Weeks passed, and Valeria found herself slipping into Ian's world in ways she hadn't anticipated. She still ran her business, still commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals, but her nights no longer ended alone in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. Instead, she found herself in Ian's kitchen, helping Emma with her homework, laughing over burnt toast on lazy Sunday mornings, and waking up to the warmth of Ian's arms around her. It was terrifying in its simplicity. She had spent years believing that love was a distraction, that it made people weak. But Ian didn't make her weak. He made her stronger, steadier, like she was finally standing on solid ground for the first time in her life, which was why she knew exactly what she had to do. The restaurant was quiet, the kind of place where conversations were meant to be intimate rather than loud. Ian sat across from her, his blue eyes steady as he sipped his whiskey. Valeria set her glass down, her pulse thrumming in her ears. "I need to tell you something," she said. Ian raised a brow. "That sounds serious." "It is." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm in love with you." Ian's fingers tightened around his glass, his expression unreadable. She pushed forward before she lost her nerve. "I don't say things I don't mean. And I don't do things without thinking them through. So believe me when I say this isn't just something I feel today. It's something I know." Ian exhaled, setting his glass down. Then slowly, he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You have no idea how long I've been waiting for you to say that," he said, his voice low. Her breath caught. Then, without another word, he stood, pulling her up with him. And right there, in the middle of the restaurant, he kissed her. It wasn't rushed or hesitant. It was steady, sure, just like him. And Valeria knew, without a doubt, she had made the right choice. Months later, Ian took her to the park where everything had shifted between them. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves golden as they crunched beneath their feet. Emma ran ahead, her laughter bright as she chased a falling leaf. Valeria turned to Ian, smiling. "She loves it here." Ian nodded, but there was something unreadable in his expression. Then, before she could ask, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Valeria's breath hitched. Ian didn't kneel because that wasn't him. Instead, he took her hand, his grip firm and unwavering. "I love you," he said simply. "And I want to spend the rest of my life loving you." She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "I know you're not used to letting people in," he continued. "But I don't want to be someone you let in. I want to be someone you build a life with." Tears pricked at her eyes. "Say yes," he murmured. "Because I can't imagine a single day without you." Valeria exhaled shakily, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "Yes." Ian slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, holding her like he never planned to let go. And for the first time in her life, Valeria Monroe wasn't standing on the outside looking in. She was home.